I want to thank everybody for coming out. My name is Jason Dedman. I'm the director at the Onslow County Board of Elections, and today we're here for a voter information seminar. We're having this presentation, and then there's another presentation at 6 o'clock. If you would all help me welcome our presenter, Ms. Terry Harris, all the way from Raleigh, North Carolina.
Thank you, Jason. Good afternoon. I apologize for the delay. My GPS didn't want me to come here. It wanted me to go someplace else, and so I had to make a few stops to get the right directions. But I won't keep you long. This presentation typically takes about an hour to an hour and a half, and so we should be able to stay on course with that. Let me ask, if any of you, how many of you are precinct officials? You work at the polls on election day. Are there any? Only one. Any staff from the Board of Elections or board members from the Board of Elections? Wonderful, wonderful. It's helpful for me to know those two. As we go through, there are areas, and I'll say this up front, and this could apply to those of you who raised your hand and the other guests as well. There are a number of places that I will discuss throughout this presentation that will make you think, wow, how are they going to accomplish that at the polls? How are they going to make that happen? What's that going to look like? Unfortunately, the answers to those questions we don't have yet. There's a public rules-making process that takes place. It started July 1 and it goes through the end of the year, and it works out the details of the how-to details. And so you'll hear me refer, when you have questions that fall in that category, you'll hear me refer to, we have to wait for those answers because they come, the cart is sort of put before the horse. This session is mandatory to take place now, prior to September 1, but the rules-making process takes place afterwards. But there'll be plenty of questions that you'll have that I will be able to answer. If you don't mind, we're going to discuss a number of things this afternoon, 4 topics to be exact. The one topic, and the topic that most of you are probably most interested in, is the new voter ID laws. But in addition to the voter ID laws, we'll also discuss provisional ballots. And in this seminar, provisional ballots tie into the voter ID laws quite a bit. We'll talk about some existing laws that pertain to voter registration as well as voter residency. And so those are the 4 topics that we'll discuss. We are being recorded this afternoon, and so what I'd like to do, after each of those topics, I'll open the floor for questions. I think there's a microphone that's someplace out there that you'll be able to use to ask your questions so that these questions can be broadcast as well as the answers. So it's not going to be easy for you to just shoot questions at me while I'm talking because we need to wait until we get to a certain part. I apologize because I know that some people have a difficult time holding on to their question when they have one. And so if you could bear with me until we get to the end of each section, I'd be glad to answer the questions that you have. Let's go ahead and get started. We're going to talk about the new voter ID requirements. As most of you probably already know, the new voter ID requirements don't take place this year in this year's municipal elections. Does Onslow County have municipal elections this year? So when you go to vote for the municipal elections this year, you won't need an ID. Those new voter ID laws take effect next year, the primary election of 2020. There's some confusion because when the law first passed, it was scheduled to take place in 2019. However, that was changed, and so it won't take place until 2020, and we want to make that very clear. Voters who present themselves to the polls effective the primary election of 2020 will have to show a picture ID, and we'll talk about that at length, and we'll talk about some of the exceptions to that law. Even when you're voting absentee by mail, you'll still be required to show identification. We'll talk about how that looks or what that process looks like. If you see on the screen here, there are many, many types of IDs that will be acceptable for you to use in the 2020 election. If you recall, there was a voter ID law that passed a few years ago, and one of the complaints was that there aren't enough types of IDs that our voters can use to vote. There are not enough options. Well, that seems to be resolved because in 2020, any voter can use any of these IDs to vote. And we're going to look at those IDs individually. For starters, in 2020, starting with the primary election, any voter can use their driver's license, their North Carolina driver's license, or their DMV identification card. The driver's license or DMV identification card can even be expired as long as it's not expired for more than 1 year. So that's an acceptable ID. An acceptable ID also includes your U.S. passport or passport card. You can use those in 2020 to vote. Same expiration requirement. They can be expired, but for no more than 1 year. If you're in the military, and this happens to be a military town, so there should be at least someone voting that's in the military or a veteran. Military and veteran IDs can also be used, and there's no expiration limit on those. Your military or veteran ID could have expired 40, 50 years ago. You can still use that to vote in 2020. If you are a member of a federally recognized tribe, you can use your tribal ID to vote in 2020. There's no expiration limit on those federal tribal cards, and so if your ID expired 5 years or 50 years ago, you can use those regardless. Now, differently from the federal tribal cards, if you have a state-recognized tribal card, it's a different process. Persons who have a state-recognized tribal card will be required to, their tribe will be required to have their tribal cards approved in advance. And so in order for you to use your state-recognized tribal card, that card has to be approved in advance. There's a website there at the bottom in the yellow, voterid.ncsbe.gov/voter ID. That's where a tribe would go. You'll hear in a few minutes that it's the same process for students and government employees. A state tribal organization would have to go to that website, complete the process so that their IDs are approved in advance and can be used for the 2020 election. Again, that is for state tribes, state-recognized tribes, not federal. The approval process for these IDs that need pre-approval, it had ended in May, and then there wasn't enough time for these organizations to get their approvals done, and so that deadline has been extended through November 1st. And so anyone who falls in the category where their IDs have to be approved in advance, they have until November 1st to get those approvals and those requests in. If you have a state-recognized tribal card, there's no expiration limit on those as well. If you're a student, and that's a student of any state or private university or community college, the same process. Those IDs have to be approved, and so this is the university, the school itself would apply would apply to have their IDs approved so that their students can use those IDs in the 2020 election. They would go to that same website. Any of you could go to that same website and see if a particular school or a particular tribe has been approved. Or you can see, get the application and see what the process is to get IDs approved. The expiration limit for student IDs won't take effect until the 2021 election. And so the expiration for those student IDs you don't have to worry about in the 2020 election. Again, the deadline for getting your IDs approved has been extended through November 1st, even for the students. And then there are IDs for employees, employee IDs. That includes any state or local government agency, public charter schools, or public universities. Government IDs can also be used in the 2020 election to vote, but that they have to complete the pre-approval process as well. And so not the employee, but the agency would need to complete the process that's on that website that's in gold there to ensure that their employees are allowed to use their government IDs to vote in 2020. The deadline for them as well has been extended through November 1st of 2019, and there's no expiration requirement on employee IDs until the 2021 election. If you recently moved to North Carolina from another state, in 2020 you can actually use your out-of-state driver's license to vote, as long as you moved here within the last 90 days leading up to the election. You can use your out-of-state driver's license to vote in 2020. There's a 1-year expiration, so if you're using an out-of-state driver's license, it can be expired, but for no more than 1 year. Let's say you're over 65. You might have any of those IDs that we looked at and talked about already. You can use any of those. But where the expiration date is concerned, if you're over 65, as long as you were 65 when your ID expired, it doesn't matter if it's expired or how long ago it expired. So some, like your driver's license, can only be expired for 1 year. But if you're over 65 and your driver's license expired when you were 70 and you haven't driven in 10 years, the 1 year expiration doesn't apply anymore. If your ID expired after your 65th birthday, it can be expired for 50 years or 70 years. It wouldn't matter. And so persons over 65 have a grace period for their expiration based on their ID having expired after their 65th birthday. So let's say the IDs that we've looked at so far include the majority of IDs that the average person will bring to the polls, that the average person might already have. So let's say you don't have any of those. You don't have a driver's license or student ID or a tribal ID. You don't have a government employee ID. You don't have any of the IDs that we talked about. Then what? The law requires that every every county board of elections makes available to you a free photo ID that you can use for the purpose of voting in 2020. This ID is available currently. It's been available since May to any registered voter. You would go to the County Board of Elections to obtain it, and it's free of charge. You would simply go to the County Board of Elections. On the necessary form, they would have you complete your name, your date of birth, and the last 4 digits of your Social Security number. They would check to make certain that you're a registered voter. They would take your picture, and they would present you with the new free photo ID card. That free photo ID card doesn't expire for 10 years. It's good for 10 years. The process requires that you have a photo ID and be registered to vote. And so if you go into the County Board of Elections office to get that free ID and you're not registered, the County Board of Elections would have to register you in order for you to get that free ID. You have to be a registered voter. If you're not a registered voter, your ID card would be mailed to you. If you are a registered voter, and it's a good day, the County Board of Elections will give you your ID in person. And when I say good day, as long as the machines are working properly, if you showed up on a bus with 40 people, the Board of Elections has the authority to mail you your cards because it takes longer to process that many. And so if you come in and you're the only person there to get an ID, you're likely to get it handed to you that day. Otherwise, they'll put it in the mail to you. Once you receive your new voter ID card from the Board of Elections, if that card is lost or stolen, or if you change your name by some chance, the Board of Elections will replace that card for you free of charge. How does the new voter ID laws affect early voting, one-stop voting? As always, the voter would present themselves to vote during the early voting period. They would be asked their current name and address, which they would give to the precinct official, followed by they would be asked for that photo ID that's required starting the primary election of 2020. Every precinct, every voting location in every county for North Carolina is required to have the ability for someone who is disabled to vote from the curbside. You can pull up in your car. If you are disabled and unable to come inside the enclosure to vote, you can vote from your car. So how does voter ID affect that process? You would pull up in your car. You would be asked, as always, your name, your address, and there's an oath that you have to sign and attest to that you are in fact disabled. And in 2020, at that point, you would be asked for your ID. One of the questions that we get quite a bit, we've gotten with these seminars, is if I, who am not disabled, brings my grandmother to the precinct to vote, and she's disabled, and so we go curbside so that my grandmother can vote. Since I'm in the car with her, and the line for the non-disabled people wraps around the building, can I also vote in the car with my grandmother? The answer is no. You have to be disabled to vote from the car. There's the oath that you have to sign explains that. And lots of people say, well, I can't leave my grandmother. I can't, she can't stay in the car alone. So I would have to vote from the car. You would have to make other accommodations for, in that case, only disabled persons can vote from the car. How about absentee voting by mail? How does voter ID affect those persons who vote by mail? Voters who are voting by mail will be required to include a photocopy of their ID. Now we're talking about all of the acceptable IDs that we've already seen. You would have to include a photocopy of that acceptable ID along with your application for your absentee ballot. The rules process will confirm whether or not you have to send that photo ID picture or the photocopy of your photo ID along with the application for your absentee ballot, or you sending it with the absentee ballot itself. We haven't gotten confirmation yet. The rules process will determine which of those, but one of those two processes, because it is a two-part process to vote absentee by mail, one of those two parts of the process will require you to send in your ID. Military and overseas voters that are overseas voting, not military, not local military, but overseas military voters will not have to include a photograph with their absentee ballot requests. And persons who are unable, you're voting absentee by mail, but you're unable to include a photograph of your picture ID. You don't have a copy machine, You couldn't get down to the local office Mac store to make a copy. You have a copy machine, it doesn't have ink. Those types of situations, there's a process called a reasonable impediment. I've said this 12 million times. I can't believe I forgot. Reasonable impediment, and we're going to talk about that at length, where you can basically indicate that you were unable to include a photocopy of your ID, and that will be acceptable because you've declared a reasonable impediment. We'll talk a great deal about other types of reasonable impediments. So the big question is, in 2020, can a voter come in and vote even though they don't have an ID? And so they don't have a driver's license, they don't have a student ID, they don't have a military ID, they didn't come down to the Onslow County Board of Elections and get that free ID. It's election day, they'd like to vote, they have no ID. Will registered voters in North Carolina be allowed to vote even though they don't have an ID? Yes. No voters in North Carolina will be turned away from the polls and not given the ability to vote based on the fact that they don't have an ID. The law requires that every voter, every registered voter who comes to the polls to vote, if in fact they do not have an ID, they would be given a provisional ballot. We'll talk about provisional ballots at length, but they would be given a provisional ballot that gets processed during the canvass process. So you'll be asked when you come to the polls for your name, your address, and your ID. If you're unable to supply or present an ID, you will be offered a provisional ballot. There are two different categories of persons that will receive provisional ballots for the purpose of not having an ID. There are two different categories. One person that comes to the polls and doesn't have an ID simply doesn't have their ID on them. I have a driver's license. I have a government ID. I have a military ID. I just didn't bring it today. It's in the car. It's at home. It's in the kitchen. That's one category. Those individuals will be required to bring their ID to the Board of Elections. They would be given a provisional ballot initially. They would be required by the end of canvass to bring their ID card to the Board of Elections office. And then that will ensure that their provisional ballot counts. The other category of persons that don't have IDs are persons who simply don't have an ID. They don't have any of the IDs that we talked about. So those persons, there's a different process for them that we'll see in a second. Oh, before we start to talk about provisional ballots, I told you at the end of each section I'd let you ask questions. And so just keep in mind the provisional ballots will speak to all of the people who come to the polls without an ID. And so that's coming up. And so if you have questions specific to voter ID, I'll take those questions now. He has a mic. Jason will bring that to you.
I'm just going to test. Yeah, okay, it's working.
My question is with the voter ID card, can that be used as a government form picture ID on other occurrences?
I'm sorry, say it one more time.
Your voter ID card, if you do not have a government photo ID, could that be used as a government voter ID other than for voting?
The free photo ID that you obtained from the Board of Elections office is only good for voting.
Okay, thank you.
It doesn't, it's not good to work anywhere else for any other purpose.
Let me make sure I got this correct here now. You mentioned that you can use your driver license.
Yes,
You don't have to have a special driver license.
no.
Okay.
A North Carolina driver's license or an out-of-state driver's license if you just moved here within 90 days.
Okay. The other question I have is that disabled. Is there a certain percentage of disability you're talking about in terms of, you know, you can have you be disabled and can still move around. Is there a limitation on that?
So the law requires that you have it's difficult for you to get inside the voting enclosure. And so it's not specific to a particular type of disability, no.
Okay. As long as I got a plaque on the car, huh?
They don't have to have a plaque on the car either.
Really?
You would have to be able to sign that oath stating that you are disabled and unable to go into the voting enclosure.
Okay, we're good.
I think you use the term by the end of canvass. I don't know what that means.
Canvass takes place 10 days after the day of the election. It's a process where they process absentee ballots and provisional ballots. It's during that process.
Can you tell me where the Board of Elections is in Onslow County and the hours, the days, so that if someone needs to go and do this, I would have that information?
I don't have a clue, but I guarantee you Jason will be glad to tell you.
Correct me if I'm wrong, V. 246 Georgetown Road. And we are open from 8 a.m. till 5 p.m. Monday through Friday.
Jason, that's such a small place there. You be standing out in line for a long time. How come you don't have a bigger place to go? You understand where I'm coming from? Last time I was over there on Georgetown Road, it was a small building you go into. But rather than having people wait out there in line for a long time, why not have it up at the offside like you used to? At a common, excuse me.
I believe you're asking about one-stop voting? Okay. This was just for the special election. That was when Walter B. Jones passed away. That was not planned. And so that's a special election. And that's why one stop was just at the Board of Elections and not at multiple locations like it normally is, sir. That's not a permanent change. Each election, we have a Board of Elections, and the board decides, some Democrat, some Republican on the board, and they all agree and decide on where the one-stop locations are.
Question over here.
So you mentioned that for the universities, colleges, and state tribal cards and employee cards, that they have to go through this process. Is that process to get those IDs approved as simple as, this is our ID, this is what it looks like, so you have it on file, or are there requirements on or restrictions on you're only giving these IDs out to, say, American citizens, or are there restrictions on who those people can give their IDs out to in order for them to qualify?
I'm not aware of there being any restrictions on who the universities can give their IDs to, but the process is involved in as far as what the ID has to be.
Okay.
And so, there are requirements that the ID have a photograph.
Right.
And so some universities had student IDs that didn't have pictures on them. And so one of the requirements is that it have a picture. Of course, there's a requirement that it have a name.
Yeah.
And so there's some basic requirements, but I'm not aware of any requirement that would limit who the school could give an ID, one of their school IDs to.
And then with the voter ID card that you can get from the Board of Elections, is there a cutoff date in advance of the election, or if you show up during early voting or on election day, would you be able to get a voter ID card on that day?
The cutoff is the cutoff for early voting. And so after the end of early voting, you would not be able to get that ID from the County Board of Elections.
During early voting, when you can do same-day registration, you can also get your voter ID card at that time and cast your ballot.
You could,
Okay.
yes.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other hands. We'll move on to talk about provisional ballots. We talk about voter ID in this section quite a bit as well. So provisional ballots is not a new process. The North Carolina elections have allowed persons to vote provisional ballots instead of regular ballots on election day for many, many years. Provisional ballots are usually issued to voters that have an issue with their ballot at the polls. Maybe they think that they received the wrong ballot. Maybe they think that they're a registered voter, but the rolls in the books at the precinct says that you're not a registered voter. Those voters would get a provisional ballot, and that process would be figured out and confirmed between the day that they're attempting to vote and the canvass period. If there's a question about the voter's eligibility to vote in a particular election, those persons would also receive a provisional ballot, and that process would be worked out during the canvass process. If there's any question about the voter's eligibility to vote a particular ballot style, you would receive a provisional ballot. You know, sometimes people come in and they say, I want to vote for Terry Harris. She's running for mayor of Onslow, and I'd like to vote for her, but she's not on this ballot that you gave me. I see other people on this ballot, but she's not, and I want to vote for Terry because she's a colleague of mine. And usually it's because you're not in the same municipality as she. And so there are reasons like that people come in with an expectation to get one ballot type or style that they're unable to, and instead they would get a provisional ballot so that those persons can have the opportunity to vote if they in fact qualify to vote that way. The three provisional ballot options or reasons that are listed here aren't new. Those are provisional ballot reasons that persons would get a provisional ballot that have existed for many, many years. The new option for receiving a provisional ballot includes the voter ID. If you don't have a ID the day that you come to vote, you would get a provisional ballot. The first three options, the board would later determine if this person with this qualification issue or the wrong ballot style issue, the board would determine if those persons, if their provisional ballots count or not count. The voter ID issue with provisional ballots is different. And so the way that they're processed and the way that they're counted is a different process. If a voter does not present an acceptable photo ID at the polls, they will be given a provisional ballot. Any voter who indicates that they have a reasonable impediment would have the opportunity to indicate that in the provisional ballot process. I explained that a person who comes to the polls who says they have an ID, they know where it is, I have one, I just don't have it on me. Those persons have to come back to the Board of Elections, not back to the precinct, but to the Board of Elections with their ID before canvass so that their provisional ballots are counted. There's a different process for those voters who indicate a reasonable impediment. And these are the legal reasons that a person is indicating that the reason that they don't have an ID, the reason that they can't present an ID at the polls. The law says that any voter can indicate that a lack of transportation is the reason why they don't have an ID. I'm at the polls today. I don't have any of those IDs that Terry talked about. I'd like to vote. Lack of transportation is one of the reasonable impediments that a voter could indicate that would give them the right to cast a provisional ballot, and that provisional ballot would count. Lack of transportation simply means that I didn't have a ride, maybe. I didn't have a ride to get to the Board of Elections. I didn't have a ride to get to the DMV. Disability or illness. I've been sick for 6 months. That illness prevented me, or that disability prevented me from going to the Board of Elections to get the free ID. It prevented me from going to the DMV or to getting to my university to get an ID. Disability or illness. Lack of birth certificate. Lack of birth certificate simply means that this person has a birth certificate, but when they went to the DMV to get their driver's license, because they need that to vote, the DMV required that they have a birth certificate, and they don't know where their birth certificate is. My birth certificate's lost. My parents lost my birth certificate when I was 12. My house burned down last year. I don't have a birth certificate. The DMV wouldn't give me an ID because I didn't have a birth certificate. That's a reasonable impediment that's laid out in the law. My work schedule prevented me from getting an ID. I work from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday through Saturday. The hours that I'm off work, the Board of Elections is closed. The hours that I'm off work, the DMV is closed. My work schedule prevented me from getting the ID required to vote. All of these reasonable impediments are those that can be indicated that would give a person the right to vote a provisional ballot. Family responsibilities is included. I take care of my grandmother 24/7. I can't leave her alone. That family responsibility prevented me or prevents me from going to the Board of Elections to get a photo ID. That same reason prevents me from going to the DMV. A family responsibility prevented me from getting the ID that I'm required to have to vote. Reasonable impediments also include a person that would otherwise have an ID, but their ID has been lost or stolen. And so I have a driver's license. I've had one for many years. Last week, my purse was snatched. My wallet was in that purse, and all of my IDs were in there. I haven't been able to replace them. I'm here today to vote, but I don't have the ID. I don't have my driver's license because it's been lost or stolen. That's a reasonable impediment. Maybe my purse was stolen last week. I went to the DMV to have my driver's license replaced, and the DMV said, no problem, took another picture. They said, we're going to put your ID in the mail. You'll receive it in about 14 days. You're liable to say, I'm going to need it by Tuesday because Tuesday's the election. And the DMV is going to say, we're going to put it in the mail and you'll get it in about 14 days. I have an ID. I've applied for my ID. I haven't received it yet. That's a reasonable impediment. So one of the questions that we get pertaining to that is, well, the DMV will give you a sheet of paper when you go in to have your driver's license replaced. And it has a photograph of you, and it has your address and all the information that your driver's license normally would have. So can I just bring that piece of paper to the polls? Unfortunately, the answer is no. At the polls, you have to have your actual ID. That paper that the DMV gives you, that works if a police pulls you over for running a red light. They'll accept that. They understand that you have a driver's license that's coming in the mail. That absolutely will not work for you at the polls. You need your actual ID, but that's why there's a reasonable impediment, or I assume that's why one of the reasonable impediments is that I've applied for my ID and I haven't received it yet. And then there's an other. And so at the polls, you are simply going to check which of these reasonable impediments apply to you. You're not giving the explanation, the explanations that I gave about I take care of my grandmother 24/7. You're not giving the explanation. You're simply indicating which of these reasonable impediments apply to you and why you don't have an ID. But other is one of the options, and there will be a line where you have to indicate what your other is. We're not sure exactly how that's going to look or be processed, but we expect that people like, let's say the federal or the state tribal IDs that have to be pre-approved. Maybe you have a state tribal ID, but it was never pre-approved. And so you can't use that ID, and so that could be your other. And so persons will have the opportunity to indicate what their other reasonable impediment is. There's a few other exceptions that would allow a person to vote a provisional ballot, and they include religious objection. A religious objection is an objection to being photographed. There are religions that don't allow persons to actually have pictures taken of them. If that's an issue that you have, you would indicate that on the provisional ballot process, and your provisional ballot would count. There's some persons that have not necessarily an objection to being photographed, but if you can't unveil or expose your face so that you can be photographed at the Board of Elections, the same applies. We're not going to take and give you a photograph of your face covered, and so you would use the religious objection as your explanation for not having an ID. And lastly, a natural disaster. You can indicate a natural disaster is the reason that you do not have a photo ID if a natural disaster has been declared by the president or the governor, and we're talking the president of the United States, or the governor for Onslow County. So you can't declare this if there was a natural disaster in Carteret and you're in Onslow. It has to be in your county, a natural disaster that's declared within the past 100 days leading up to the election. You can say the reason that I don't have an ID is because there was a natural disaster. We understand that is, your house is gone and your ID was in the house. And so it's going to take some time, and so that's allowed as well. We want to strongly emphasize that no person will be turned away from the polls on Election Day in 2020 simply because they do not have an ID. Those persons will all be given provisional ballots and the opportunity to vote. Any questions about provisional ballots? Yes, he's going to bring you the mic.
So the reasonable impediment affidavit should really only be coming into play, then it sounds like, through the absentee ballot process or or on Election Day, outside of maybe the religious objection, because otherwise if you show up at early voting, you'd be able to get an ID and comply with that requirement.
It can be used at any point during the process. Absentee voting, early voting, Election Day, you can use the reasonable impediments and indicating that you don't have an ID at any of those points. But if you think about the precinct where you're voting is not the place where you would get an ID. Mm-hmm. And so
right.
It's a different location.
Yeah.
You can only get your ID at the Board of Elections, which is a different place. Usually, it's a different place than the place where you're actually voting. So you have the ability to use and take advantage of the provisional ballot reasonable impediment process throughout the entire election process.
Gotcha. Thank you.
That would be like if you showed up at Northside in 2020, you don't have an ID, you'd have to drive all the way to, the Board of Elections and then go back there, and maybe you can't do that, I think.
Is it the Board of Election that determines the validity of the provisional ballots, and how long does that take them after an election?
It is the board, not the Board of Elections, but the board that governs the Board of Elections that make those determinations.
Yes, ma'am. We have a board member here, Mrs. Wright, and so there's 4 other board members. And what happens is we review the provisional votes. Staff reviews them. The board approves them. They can be approved, completely approved, partially approved, or not counted. And they decide that from themselves, and that would be, if there was an objection, it would have to be like 3-2, right? And if it's 3-2, then whoever, if there's 3 saying count it, 2 saying don't count it, then it counts. Am I right there?
I'm not able to speak to how the board counts the provisional ballots. I don't know that process well
Yeah,
enough.
so we just went through that process, and normally it's black and white. We didn't have any arguments over provisional ballots. There's certain times where someone is registered one party, but they decided they wanted to vote another party, get the wrong ballot or something like that on purpose. They want that. We can't say no to them. We have to give them a provisional ballot. Well, then when it gets to the time where we review them, which is during the canvass process, then that vote may or may not count. And in that case, it probably would not count. And each provisional ballot, when you're given a provisional ballot, you're given a phone number to call and see if your vote counted or not. Everything has a timeline in this business. Yes, ma'am.
Ballot. In the event it did not clear, has the voter finished? Is that final, or do you ever contact the voter for further clarification?
Jason, I'll let you answer that.
If we had any questions that were unanswered, I'm sure we could contact the voter, but generally based on how you're registered, where you're registered, which ballot you should have got, which ballot style you should have got, what party you're with, what type of election it was, a primary or, general, that type of thing. There's normally not any question that needs to be answered. It's more, these are the facts, and this is why. The most common one was an unreported move. The last time we had, I think almost every one of them. Okay, unreported move is the most commonly provisional ballot reason for a provisional ballot. So you show up, say at Bryn Mawr, and you used to vote at West Northwoods. Well, you notified everyone that you were moving except us. Okay, I'm not faulting you for that. Moving is a big experience. So rather than telling you that day at Bryn Mawr, hey, you have to go to West Northwoods, they're going to vote you provisionally at Bryn Mawr. When we canvass, we're going to know based on our computer system, our data, oh, they lived here, now they're saying they live here. That's an unreported move. So we're going to check, as employees, we're going to check unreported move. We recommend complete approval. We're going to present that recommendation to the board. The board makes a decision, not us. But I've never had the board object to an unreported move vote ballot.
Jason, how do you know if your provisional ballot is actually counted?
So there's a phone number they're going to give you if you vote a provisional ballot. You're going to call that number after a certain date, and it's going to let you know if your vote counted or not. And then if you have questions, you could call and ask to speak with me. I'm not going to be able to overturn the board's decision, but I could counsel you on, let's say this is just a for instance, okay? You're a registered Republican. I don't know what you're registered. I'm guessing here, okay? Let's say you're a registered Republican, just for an example. You want to vote in the primary as a Democrat. I'm going to have to give you a provisional ballot because you're not supposed to get it, but I can't tell you no, okay? Well, when we go to canvass, you call that number, that vote's not going to count. You're going to call me, you might be upset that your vote didn't count. I'm going to say, sir, I'm very sorry. You were registered Republican. You voted Democrat ticket in the primary. If you want to vote in the next election and you want to vote Democratic, you could either choose to be registered as a Democrat or you could choose to be registered unaffiliated. And then if you're unaffiliated, you could choose Republican or Democrat each time at your discretion. Does that answer your question? Okay.
There's another place that you can look to see if your provisional ballot's counted, and this is statewide. The State Board of Elections website has a place where you can type yourself in. It will tell you where you go to vote. It will confirm that you're active or actively registered to vote. And then if you've voted provisional, it will then also tell you if your provisional ballot counted. But again, this is after the canvass process, before they would be able to update that system. And so there are multiple ways. There's a phone number that you could call, or you could go to the State Board of Elections website to see if your provisional ballot did in fact count. Yes, ma'am.
Why does it matter? I don't need that. Why does it matter where someone votes?
I'll let Jason answer.
Texas, when I was in the military, I went to the wrong voting. Well, you gotta go across. Like, this is a while ago, a long, long time ago, and went all the way over there. Oh, why can't I vote here? This was 1980. Why does it matter where you vote?
We have 24 precincts in Onslow County. So it matters where you vote because of municipal elections.
Well, I'm talking about like the 2020 election. That's a big one. Why can't they just vote anywhere?
Well, they can. We're not.
Even if it's provisional,
Yeah, we're never going to deny anyone. Let's say you live in East Northwoods and you show up at New River and you say, I want to vote here today and I'm only voting here. They're going to give you a provisional ballot, and
even though you haven't already.
yeah,
If you're in the wrong location.
yeah. So, well, the reasoning is you're normally registered where you live.
Right.
So, for instance, let me just use myself. I live in West Northwoods. So when it's time for me to vote, my polling location, I could actually throw a baseball a few times and there's where I vote, or just a short brisk walk or drive a car. It's not always that close, but generally your polling place is picked because of where you live.
And that's the law. The law requires that you vote within certain boundaries of where you live. And so there are hundreds of different ballot styles within an election. If you drive down the street to a different precinct, there are different people on those ballots than the people that appear on your ballots. Per district, by district, absolutely. And so the people that you vote for will vary from block to block, or it could street to street even. And so that's how your precincts are determined.
For instance, like for city, you're running to be on the board of at the city councilman. They have at large, which everyone could vote for, but then you have certain numbers. You're voting for this number or that number, and so, like she was saying, she wanted to vote for her friend who lived in a certain area, and she walked in and they weren't on the ballot. Well, you could go ahead and vote that, but it's not going to count if that's not your precinct. Yeah. So does that answer your question? We don't do it just because we decided to do it.
Well, I don't understand in this day and age why people can't get an ID. About the reason. Vote and they complain that they can't vote because they don't have an ID, and in this day and age, that'd be a problem.
Sure. And that's just how the legislature wrote the law. And so they built it that way. They wrote it that way. They listened to a lot of different sides of the issue.
They're supposed to get the IDs. There's no excuse. That's what I'm saying.
And there is a public comment in the rules-making process. There's a public comment section where you can actually email a comment, or you could come to the State Board of Elections to be a part of the rulemaking process, and it discussed those things. Now, the law is written already, and so the reasonable impediments are already included, but how those things are processed and different aspects of it, you could be involved in that process.
There should be a way to be able to reach out to these people who can't get there or can't get out. After the election.
And we will be, and we're going to talk about the efforts that we're making to ensure that everyone has an ID the best we can.
My question is there any type of safety net for a voter that in the event that they complete a provisional ballot, that ballot vote is not wasted? So in other words, if there's something that happens that a person calls that number and they voted provisionally and something occurred, they didn't follow the letter, now their vote is gone once it's canvassed. Is there anything up front that can prevent that if they need to change something, they can come back in to vote so their vote is not lost?
Voter education is always the best tool. And so this seminar is voter education. And so it, gives people the opportunity up front to understand what's expected. The provisional ballot process, there's so many different reasons that a person would receive a provisional ballot. Some of those things are explained at the precinct. If you're if it's the primary election and you're a Democrat and you insist on getting a Republican ballot, those types of things will be explained. If you insist on getting a ballot outside of the ballot that you're supposed to get, that will not count. And there's not anything beyond that would be done to educate the voter. Any other questions? You'll have plenty of opportunities. If a question comes to mind and we've passed that section, we can still entertain those questions. Let's move on to talk about voter registration. This also isn't a new, these aren't new laws, but they're noteworthy to make sure that the public understands how North Carolina elections work. How can you register to vote? In order to register to vote in North Carolina, you must be legally qualified to vote, and you must live, obviously, in North Carolina and complete a voter registration application. What qualifies you to be registered to vote in North Carolina? One, you must be a citizen of the United States. You must live in the county that you are registering in and have lived there 30 days prior to the date of the election. You must be 18 years of age. There's an exception that we'll talk about in a second, but for the most part, you must be 18 years old to vote. And you must not be serving a felony sentence. If you've been convicted of a felony, you must have completed all parole and probation and paid all restitution before you're able to register to vote and vote. The exception to being 18 years old includes a person that is 17 years old. A 17-year-old can actually vote in the primary election as long as they're going to be 18 by the general election. And then the other exception to being 18 to register is pre-registrants. And so teenagers, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds can register when they go into the DMV to get their driver's license for the first time. They can register during high school voter registration drives. They're registering, but they're not able to vote yet. And so they're pre-registering so that when they're of age, they're already set to go. Where can you register to vote? The State Board of Elections website, that's what you see on the screen there is one of the places that you can download the voter registration application. You can complete that and you can mail it to the county board of elections that you live in. On a regular basis after the election, we get phone calls from voters that say, I registered to vote on your website, and when I got to the polls, they said that I wasn't registered to vote, because you can't register to vote on a website. The voter registration process is a pen and paper process. You can download the form from the website, but you can't submit it back through the website to vote, to be registered. And so you can get the form from many different websites, but you have to print that form, complete that form, sign that form, and send that form to the Board of Elections. You can get those voter registration applications from the State Board of Elections in Raleigh, that's my office, or from any county Board of Elections office, from any public library, or any high school or university. Very commonly, voters will get voter registration applications during voter registration drives. The one thing that I would caution any voter is, or any person that is distributing voter registration information, be sure that your voter registration applications are current. In North Carolina, the applications typically change every year. And so if you've got a big stack of voter registration forms in your trunk from 2 years ago, you can throw those in the trash. We've changed voter registration applications 2 or 3 times since 2 years ago. And so make sure that you're using current forms, because it too can make a difference in the process. Where else can you register to vote? You can register to vote at the DMV office, or at any social service office, any WIC office, any disability services agencies, or any division of employment security. You can register to vote. You are required to register to vote 25 days before the day of the election. If you're getting a voter registration application from any of those agencies that we saw, you'll have to do that and complete that process 25 days before the day of the election. So what happens when it's 10 days before the election? You realize you're not registered to vote, but you'd like to vote, but you haven't met that 25-day before the election timeline. Can you still vote? The answer is yes. In North Carolina, voters can register to vote and vote at the same time during early voting. And that's the period of time leading up to the election. We're not talking about the day of the election. You can't register to vote on that day. But if you register and vote during early election, the one-stop voting period, you're allowed to register to vote and vote at the same time. You would complete a voter registration application at that time. You would have to present proof of residency at that time as well. Now, the IDs that we're about to see are not related to the 2020 voter ID laws. These IDs are specific to a person who is registering to vote and voting at the same time during early voting one-stop periods. During that time, you're required to show proof of residency, and so you could use your driver's license that has your current name and your current address, or you could use your DMV identification card that has a current name and current address, or you could use a utility bill, a bank statement, a government-issued check. You could also use your student, your college ID to prove your residency. If you use your college ID in addition to displaying your college ID, you would have to show a piece of mail that proves that you've received mail at that location, that ties the residency piece together. If your name, address, or party affiliation changes, or you would like to change them, you can do that using the same voter registration application form. There's a place on that form where you would simply indicate that your name has changed, or your address has changed, or your party affiliation has changed. Military and overseas citizens registration process is slightly different. There's some benefits to the military and overseas voters. There's a special website there, that fvap.gov is where military and overseas voters can go to learn about special programs that are specific to military voters. Any questions about that section? Let's talk about residency. Did I see a hand? No. What address are you required to use when you register to vote? A voter must use his or her permanent residency when they register to vote. The place where you live, the place, the law describes it as the place that you intend to return to after you leave. And so if you're leaving for the day to go to work, I intend to return back to my home in Onslow County. If I leave for a week to go on vacation, I intend to return back to my home in Onslow. If I go to take care of my mother in Durham for 6 months, I intend to return back to my home in Onslow County. That is my permanent residence. That's where you register to vote. That's where you vote from. You have to vote from your permanent residence. If you temporarily relocate, you absolutely can continue to vote from your permanent residence. Let's say you change your permanent residence. And so your permanent residence is here in Onslow County, but you went to take care of your mother in Wake County. You thought that you were going to come back, and then you fell in love with your mother's next door neighbor, and now you're going to stay in Wake County. And so you've moved your voter registration to Wake County. You're not coming back to Onslow anymore. Can you still vote in Onslow? Absolutely not, because you've moved your permanent residence someplace else. What about homeless persons? Are homeless persons allowed to register to vote and vote in North Carolina? What do you think? A lot of people don't know. Homeless persons in North Carolina can absolutely register to vote and vote based on where they lay their head at night. Homeless persons obviously don't have, a home necessarily, an apartment or a house. In the law, it's called a real property. But there's a map on every voter registration application. And that map allows a homeless person to indicate that if this is the main intersection, Maple Street by Main Street, you could put an X here to indicate that I sleep here at night. And the Board of Elections would use that location to determine where your precinct is. There's a geocode system that they use to determine your precinct and the location from which you vote. And so homeless persons absolutely can register to vote and vote in North Carolina. There is a requirement that they have to give a mailing address that's different from their location where they lay their head at night, just for the purpose of processing their voter registration. College students, I attend school in North Carolina. Where do I register? Where's my residency? Where's my legal residency? A student has the ability to determine or declare where their residency is. They can indicate that they intend to return back to Onslow County where their parents live after school, and they can therefore continue to vote from Onslow County, even though they're going to school in Carteret County. If the student leaves their parents' house and no that they're not coming back to Onslow County. Maybe when they left to go off to college, they said, I will never, ever, ever come and live here again. That student might want to move their permanent residency to their dorm. But that's the option that the student has. They will declare their permanent residence wherever they intend to return back to. If your daddy told you you couldn't come back when you left, you can move your permanent residency to apartment B on campus. You can only vote in one place. In North Carolina and every other place that I'm familiar with, voting in multiple places is illegal. You can only vote in one place. You can only vote one time. Voting in more than one place, also referred to as double voting, is a Class I felony. How are we notifying the public about the changes, especially where it pertains to voter ID? We've talked about a lot of things, provisional ballots and residency and voter registration, some things that haven't changed. But specific to the new voter ID laws, how are we making sure that the public knows what to expect so that they're prepared with what they need to be prepared with in 2020 for the primary election? For one, there's going to be a mailer. A mailer will go out to all registered voters prior to the 2020 primary election, indicating what the law requires, requiring you to have an ID, the types of IDs that you can use, where you can get those IDs from. Media outlets, there will be television, commercials and radio ads and newspaper ads as we get closer to the primary election in 2020. Making sure that the public understands what's required. At the polls, at the polls, there will be a requirement that there be posters and signs making it very clear to every voter that you're required to have an ID. And so we'll see in a second that there's student assistants that help out during election day. Chances are as persons approach the line on election day, someone at some point before you stand in line for 3 or 4 hours, someone will have the opportunity to ask you if you have the ID that you're required to have, so that you're not caught off guard. You have the opportunity to go back to the car if that's the solution. Precinct official training, there will be extensive precinct official training surrounding the voter ID law. How the precinct official, the poll judges, will make all of these different things happen as far as voter ID is concerned. Voter information seminars, the law requires that the State Board of Elections conducts 2 of these seminars in every county throughout the state of North Carolina prior to September 1. Local organization outreach, there are presentations that will be available on the State Board of Elections website. At some point, we're going to share those with the County Board of Elections. Presentations similar to what you see here that any of you could take to your local church, to your local community organization, and educate persons there about what the voter ID requirements are. Any information will be posted on Facebook and Twitter and County and State Board of Elections websites leading up to and increasing as we get closer to the 2020 election. Educational resources will be available and voter notification. Someone said earlier that we should reach out to people that may not have an ID. That's exactly what voter notification is. The State Board of Elections, and we did this before when there was a voter ID law, we take a complete list of everyone who's registered in North Carolina, and then we get a list, or that time, we got a list from the DMV, everyone who has a driver's license, everyone who has an ID card from the DMV, and we compare those 2 lists. If it appears that you might not have a driver's license or an ID card, we'll send you a postcard, and it says, we realize you may not have an ID based on the search that we did. If you don't, here's how you can get one. And so that type of outreach will happen as well. There are a number of ways that you can get involved in making sure that elections go smoothly in North Carolina, as well as making sure that persons are educated about the process. Election officials, those are your precinct judges. You can certainly contact your county board of elections and see if they need, oftentimes they are in need of precinct officials, and so you can contact the county board of elections to see if you're needed there. There are student election assistants. Those are high school students typically that have to get approval from their school as well as from their parents. They are paid election day workers who do a lot of the footwork that I'm just a little too old to do myself, but a lot of the runaround processes that happen on election day, student election assistants are wonderful for that. I remember in the last election where voter ID was required, and the lines were a little bit longer than they normally are, and they had student election assistants out, and they were running around, and they were running here and there and telling people that you need an ID and helping people, and it was hot outside, and I thought, shoo, I don't want that job. But young people are a little bit better able to handle that than I am. And then multi-partisan assistance teams, the MAT teams, those are the groups that are trained to go into nursing homes and facilities and register persons to vote and assist them with completing their absentee ballots. Those are typically in great need by the County Board of Elections. That's something that you could also do to be involved. The State Board of Elections website has lots of information and it changes often. There is a whole section on voter ID. It will be updated as these rules get, the rules are kind of getting ironed out piece by piece. And so that information is available on that website, as well as when the next rule hearings would be, but there's lots of information there. If there are any changes to the voter ID law, you would find that on this website as well. If you left me your email address when you signed in today, I will send you an email if there are major changes to the voter ID law. And by that I mean major changes. We had a major change because it was supposed to start in 2019, and now voter ID is starting in 2020, so that's a major change. And so if there's a major change and you've given me your email address, I would email you the fact that there has been a major change to voter ID since you were here with me. Lastly, there's great concern across the nation about voter fraud. The State Board of Elections wants you to know that we are making every effort to keep your election safe all across the state of North Carolina. And so the efforts that we've made, the details of that are on the State Board of Elections website. We're working with Homeland Security and other national organizations to keep North Carolina elections safe. But you can find and see the details of what we've done and what we're doing on the State Board of Elections website. Any questions before we leave? You all must be hungry. Okay.
When I mentioned the voter ID, I get a response. Is that just like having a real ID for the state? So I want to make sure if I can explain it.
So the real ID is a special ID that you can get from the DMV office. It doesn't matter for the purpose of voting. It doesn't matter if you have the old ID, the old driver's license, or the real ID. That none of that matters. If it's a driver's license that comes from the DMV, that's all that matters. That will work in 2020 as far as your voter ID requirement will be met either way. Any other questions? I really appreciate you coming. Thank you so much. If you didn't give me your email address, it's not too late. You can add it to your sign-in sheet just so that you're kept apprised of any major changes that happen. I appreciate you. Thank you so much.